One of the greatest delights in life is having a fresh from the oven slice of bread dripping with butter. You ever wondered how yeast works to make that bread? Well, today I'm going to teach you how yeast works and how it makes dough rise to become that light, airy, wonderful piece of bread. And there are many different types of yeast. There's brewer's yeast that's used to make alcohol. There's yeast that lives on plants and animals. There's mold on blue cheese, and there's baker's yeast, which is the yeast that is used to leaven bread. And that is the type of yeast I want to speak about today. So first, I'm going to define yeast. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines yeast as the yellowish surface froth or sediment that occurs especially in saccharine liquids, such as fruit juices, in which it promotes alcoholic fermentation, consists largely of cells of a fungus, and is used especially in the making of alcoholic liquors and as leaven in baking. And DakotaYeast.com states that baker's yeast is produced from the genus and species of yeast called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. The scientific name of the genus of baker's yeast, Saccharomyces, refers to saccaro, meaning sugar, and myces, meaning fungus. The species name, cerevisiae, is derived from the name Ceres, the Roman god of agriculture. So now I'm going to talk about how yeast is made. In RedStarYeast.com compares yeast to farming. Making yeast includes preparation, seeding, cultivation, and harvesting. And in slide 2, you can see the process of making yeast. First, because yeast feeds on sugar, molasses is prepared and diluted for the yeast to feed on. After the yeast feeds on the sugars, it's called seed yeast. So next, the seed yeast is put in a warm place, and it is allowed to grow while feeding on the sugars. And then once it's grown as much as they want it to grow at that time, it's placed into refrigeration so that it is prepared so that they can cultivate it more. And this is now called stock yeast. So after that, they take the stock yeast and it's put into large tanks. And these tanks, and they're combined with molasses and air. They're fed molasses and air. And the temperature is carefully controlled so that it's at a perfect growing temperature. And the yeast is allowed to grow until it fills the tank. And then the yeast is harvested. And to harvest the yeast, the fermented liquid is passed through large centrifugal pumps called separators. And it's a lot like spinning clothes in a washing machine, so it goes really fast. And the yeast cells are concentrated and then taken out of the tanks. And this is an off-white liquid called cream yeast. And then the yeast cells are processed further and dried to make the yeast that is used in bakeries and homes worldwide. So now I will discuss the function of yeast. DakotaYeast.com suggests that there are 3 different functions of yeast, and they are making carbon dioxide, causing dough maturation, and developing fermentation of flavor. So first, the yeast makes carbon dioxide. So as the sugars break down through the dough, carbon dioxide is released, and that is what makes the dough rise. And in slide 3, it shows a picture of dough rising. Second, yeast causes dough maturation. So after the dough rises the first time, you punch it down, you shape it into your loaves, and you put it in your baking pans, and you allow the dough to rise again. And this is when the alcohols are released, and it makes the dough light and airy and gives it the flavors. So finally, the yeast helps develop fermentation flavors. So yeast makes the flavor of the bread. And according to DakotaYeast.com, during fermentation, yeast produce many secondary metabolites such as ketones, higher alcohols, aldehydes, and esters. And some of these, like the alcohol, they escape during the baking. And others react with each other and other compounds in the dough to form new and more complex flavors in the dough. And now that we've learned a little bit about how to make yeast and the different functions of yeast, we're going to talk about the different forms of yeast. And the major forms are cake, cream, and dry. When yeast comes in a cake form, it's already hydrated, and it just comes in a little cake-like thing. And you can see a picture of that in slide 4. And it can be crumbled over the dry ingredients and mixed right in. It doesn't have to be rehydrated. Cream yeast is like cake yeast, only it's in a liquid form, and it can just be added to your ingredients. However, with cream yeast, it has a very short shelf life, only about 14 days, and it has to be held in special tanks and continuously circulated. So it's not very portable, and it's not used very often. And then we have the dry form of yeast, and this is the most common form, and it has to be rehydrated before use. And it's most often called active dry yeast or instant yeast. And this is the type of yeast most people buy in the grocery stores. And it either comes in small packets or you can get a large container of it. An example of what dry yeast looks like is in slide 4 also. Now I will explain to you how to use yeast in making bread. I'm going to use dry yeast because that is the kind that I'm most familiar with. So first you combine your yeast with some sugar and some warm water, and you allow it to sit for several minutes until and let the yeast grow. And you'll know when it's ready when it bubbles up, and this is called proofing. And you can see a picture of proofed yeast in slide 5. Now when the yeast is proofed, you mix it with your flour and your other ingredients to create a dough. After mixing the ingredients together, you let the dough sit covered in a warm spot. And at this point, the first function of yeast is achieved. As I said earlier, the carbon dioxide works to make the yeast grow and the dough rise. And then next, you shape the dough. And this can be done either by forming the dough into loaves or make it into rolls and putting in a pan. And after that, you let the dough rise again. And this is when the second function of yeast happens. And that is when the alcohols are released to make the dough rise again and give it the flavors. And then after that, the bread is ready to be baked. So today we learned what yeast is. We learned how it is formed, and we learned how yeast works to leaven bread. So the next time you want to have that warm, fresh from the oven piece of bread dripping with butter, you know how that bread got to be so light and airy and delicious. Thank you.